So, welcome back. Um, Last time that I did this, it was with a friend of mine, Edgar, and we addressed some of the misunderstandings that you can see present among some of the provisionists. Not too in depth, sort of just a brief, not too serious response to Leighton Flowers and the guys from the provisionist perspective. And so we'll be going through a similar idea for this video, except dealing mainly with the Eastern Orthodox, although, of course, a lot that will be said can and often is applied to the Orientals and to provisionists other groups. But today, uh, the special focus is on the Orthodox. So just to get a general outline, first we'll have an introduction, and then of course they go through the acrostic, one that many of us find anachronistic and unhelpful and just not very useful, but of course they use it, so it's what we have to work with. And I am not doing them in the order that it's usually laid out, but the reason for that will become more apparent later. Now, the Orthodox Reformed Bridge is a website that, in their words, is intended to serve as a meeting place where Calvinists and the Orthodox can dialogue, they can ask questions, exchange opinions, and debate matters of faith in a civil manner. Now, specifically, Robert R. Cocky, the main individual that this response is geared towards, he wrote 4 blog posts, 4 articles. The main one that's going to be addressed here is going to be the one from August 12th, 2012, a decade ago, right? More than a decade ago, called Plucking the Tulip Part 1, an Orthodox critique of the Reformed doctrine of predestination, right? So there are 4 parts to it, but I don't feel too much of a need to address the other 3 parts because of the fact that part 1 is where you really get the emphases that he has. And in parts 2, 3, and 4, I don't want to say that you can just dismiss them, but it seems like a lot of elaboration on the same mistakes that he makes in part 1. So it's just further elaboration of the same things that are going to be corrected here. Now, the reason why I'm specifically doing it on Arkaki's post from more than a decade ago is because I have seen people reference it, um, either implicitly or explicitly, send it to me. And even if many of the Orthodox don't actually care about the article or what our Robert Arcaki says, still it gives us a good sort of representation, a good embodiment of the misunderstandings that the Orthodox often have. So it gives us something to respond to while addressing the broader Orthodox world, so to speak. And you can see what it looks like. Now, he starts off by suggesting that double predestination is understood as the quote hallmark of John Calvin and Reformed theology. Now, of course, this. I guess this does depend on what one means by the term hallmark. Now, of course, if by hallmark he's taking it to mean that this is sort of distinctive of Calvin and Reformed theology, I don't think that that would be the case, because we have to define, for one, double predestination, but then also what it means for something to be a hallmark. Now, the thing is, I don't think that even Arakaki believes that quote unquote double predestination is distinctive of the Reformed or of Calvin, because he does have it in one of the other parts. I believe it's part 2 of this Plucking the Tulip series, that he does say that the medieval Roman Catholic scholastics also believed in double predestination. So he does seem to note that there is Catholicity in the Reformed understanding of reprobation, at least in the West, because of course the East is going to reject Western understandings of these concepts. So it doesn't seem that he thinks that Calvin and the Reformed are the only ones who have our particular understanding of reprobation. Nonetheless, he goes on to appeal to Alistair McGrath in a footnote for two specific reasons. So, for one, to suggest that Calvin and Calvinism are not synonymous, and secondly, to note that some individuals would dispute the centrality of predestination for Calvin's theology. Now, with the first point, I can't help but fear that maybe he could have had the Calvin versus the Calvinist thesis in mind, right? Where Calvin's understandings of certain things are then sort of perverted later with the post Reformation Reformed Orthodox, or just post Reformation Calvinists, who a lot of times people would just start with appealing to Beza and moving forward, even though that's not too far from Calvin, even. Nonetheless, now, of course, Richard Mahler is probably the most well known. I have seen that Paul Helm deals with the thesis as well. I have not read Helm on this, but I have read Mahler on this. And if that is the case, for anyone who has this misunderstanding of Calvin's relationship to later Calvinism, so to speak, uh, it would be best to read Mahler on the subject. So he has two specific works. So for one, he has an article, right, the placement of predestination in Reformed theology, issue or non-issue, and then two chapters in his book, After Calvin, studies in the development of a theological tradition, where he spends two chapters devoted to continuities and discontinuities between Calvin and the later Reformed, which I think adequately deals with this thesis. Now, Arakaki's his definition of double predestination is a little vague, right? That's ambiguous to me, especially like the phrase just as and the term likewise, when he says that double predestination is the belief that just as God predestined his elect to eternal life in Christ, he likewise predestined or reprobated the rest to hell. So it's not super clear whether he has a proper understanding of reprobation in mind, or whether he might have something like equal ultimacy in mind. I think that it's probably the former. I don't really see any reason to believe that he somehow misunderstands our doctrine of reprobation to the point that, because like I said, he includes the medieval scholastics as believing in quote unquote double predestination. So unless he believes that they hold to some form of equal ultimacy, then it seems like he believes that we hold the same position that the Roman Catholics did, and that it's not like heretical, presumably. Um, but regardless of that, St. Augustine uses this basic language, which of course he may know because he does harp on the fact that the West loves Augustine, not really to suggest that the East doesn't, but that we emphasize more on him with regards to our theology. But St. Augustine does use this kind of language where he'll say that some are predestined to everlasting death, others to predestined to destruction, predestined to punishment, various things like this. Now, Calvin's centrality, which is something that I think is assumed by a lot of the Orthodox, his centrality to the Reformed faith is a bit complex, and it's not good to fall into either of two extremes of falling into the extreme of either minimizing Calvin to the point where he's not really that important to the tradition, because he certainly was, and he had a lot of influence in the tradition. That's certainly true, but we also don't want to take it to the extreme where we overemphasize his role and portray him as someone that he wasn't, anachronistically, right? Now, for point two, you can see Muller's chapter in, John Calvin, Myth and Reality, where his chapter, which is called Demoting Calvin, the issue of Calvin and the Reformed tradition. Now, this article's so-called critique of Reformed theology is said to, quote, focus on the doctrinal formula Tulip because Tulip provides a clear and concise summary of Reformed theology. Now, Richard Muller helpfully notes that, quote, both the acrostic and the associated usage of 5 points of Calvinism are of Anglo-American origin and do not date back before the 19th century. And for anyone interested, you can pause here. I'm not going to read all of it, but essentially the idea is that it's a little odd to sort of take the 5 heads of doctrine from the Synod of Dort and represent them as being some sort of holistic representation of Reformed theology, of the Reformed tradition. Like this concept of 5 points is not supposed to be one that summarizes the faith. Right? They are simply 5 responses to the 5 articles of the Remonstrance. That is really what their use is. Ryan Reeves also notes this in his video on the Dutch Revolt and Arminianism, where he says that the so-called 5 points of Calvinism from the Dort Synod are not made up out of thin air. It's not the case that the Synod of Dort was called in order to create new 5 points that will define and shape Calvinism itself. Rather, it is the Remonstrance Church, the Arminian side, that first comes up with 5 points that they believe are not in keeping with the biblical teachings, in which they propose as a reformation of the Reformed perspective. Now, when Arkaki talks about the Remonstrant movement itself, I think that he inaccurately describes it as, quote, an attempt in the early 1600s to temper the rigor of predestination by allowing for human free will in salvation. Now, I think, of course, that this is an overly simplistic understanding of the controversy with the Remonstrance and the context of the Synod of Dort, but we'll get into that a bit later. So he then provides a footnote after this, recommending his readers to read Plucking on the controversy, and you can find similar language, caricatures, misrepresentations, in people like David Bradshaw, Perry Robinson, Jay Dyer, David Erhan, Cabane, also known as Seraphim Hamilton, etc. All these guys. So, for example, Bradshaw talks about the essence energies distinction on a channel that, if you're watching this, you probably are a little familiar with, on the Gospel Simplicity YouTube channel. And during the interview, of course, Austin, as the host, asks Dr. Bradshaw about other important doctrines that might be affected depending on whether one affirms or rejects the essence energies distinction. This is something that comes up a lot when we talk about doctrines. That's essentially the entire point of doing systematic theology. Making sure that you have doctrines that don't contradict, and other doctrines can be affected depending on whether one affirms the essence energies distinction or not. And so Austin asks him about that, and in Bradshaw's perspective, one of the more important concepts that is affected is the concept of synergy, he says. And he goes on to talk about like Augustine's divine simplicity and the way that Augustine's divine simplicity affects his doctrine of predestination, of which I really agree with, actually. I think that that's not often talked about enough, especially in conflicts with people like the provisionists, since they're so new. They're not often talking about theology proper and how our understanding of the doctrine of God affects our understanding of predestination. But I think that Bradshaw is, for the most part, correct in the connection between the two. And after going on a bit of a monologue in the video about this subject, he says that, quote, "So you see how synergy has disappeared from that picture, right? And that whole idea that we're active cooperators with God through our own free choice, I think, is what's lost." And so we're going to get into this concept of synergy a bit later. Dyer says the same thing in a video, funny enough, called Monoenergism, which apparently is the ancient heresy that the reformers gave new life. And, presumably he's talking about Protestants, I know, but as he's talking, he says, what they don't understand is that there's a created energy and will that's proper to human nature, and there's the uncreated energy and will that's proper to the divine. And energy replacement of this, if we believe that grace destroys nature, which is now David Erhan. He has a debate review of the debate between James White and Trent Horn. Well, what does a debate do with Christology? Quote, I felt like during the whole debate, I very much expected at least a mention of Christology somewhat, and I didn't see that happening. So you might be thinking, well, why talk about Christology in a debate about whether one can lose their salvation? And this is where we have some foreshadowing as to what the Orthodox really seem to misunderstand. He later goes on to say that monoenergism is opposed to synergism, and that according to monergism, quote, when it comes to salvation, man's will is completely irrelevant. Now, that is a bit of a bold claim that we also are going to have to address. Perry Robinson, similar idea, where you really start to see what they're getting at, right? So Perry Robinson says that monergism is monergism in anthropology and soteriology is really, in my view, an instance of monothelitism. He even goes so far as to say the following, and I put Protestant / Reformed because from what I recall, it's not super clear if he's talking about Protestantism as a whole, the Reformation, or specifically the Reformed. Either way, both would be incorrect in what I'm about to read, but nonetheless, it's even more incorrect, especially if he's talking about specifically the Reformed. But he says that they were so committed to the monergism because they were reacting to the Neo-Semi-Pelagianism of Beale and other certain Franciscans, and they really weren't familiar with Thomas or a stronger Augustinian tradition in Aquinas, among other people. Now, that is one of the bolder claims that I have ever seen from Robinson. Now, I did try to ask him on Twitter, not through direct messages. I'm not even sure if you can direct message him. Maybe you can. But I did ask him in response to one of his tweets. It must have been about Aquinas. That is probably why I did so, but I don't remember what the original tweet was about. But I did ask, I didn't get a response, so I still don't know what he means by this. But yeah, anyone who is familiar with the reception of Aquinas and the Reformed tradition is going to be very surprised by such a statement. And this video is not super long ago, so I think it's just a failure in keeping up with the scholarship. Uh, and some of the scholarship is old, like going back to like J.P. Donnelly. I'm not just talking about some of the newer stuff. So, a really bold claim, I think. Now, Cobain, also known as Seraphim Hamilton, says that now if a monergistic gloss that is there's only one will involved, there's not two wills cooperating, but just one will. If a monergistic gloss on grace were implied by its biblical framing, this should be largely the end of the story in terms of grace's reception. right? So I think pretty clearly you can see that Cobain's understanding of monergism is that there's only one will involved, not two wills in salvation. And he also goes on to say that, quote, yet the scriptures do not understand this, that is God's acts of divine grace, to be in any kind of dichotomous relation or tension with the notion of an active, vigorous reception of this gift. So just more confirmation as to what I think Cobain's understanding of monergism is. Now, going back to Arakaki and his article, he goes on to start his section on total depravity, as it is called commonly, and he cites the Scots Confession as an example of the allegedly extreme position that the fall eradicated the divine image from human nature. And it's in chapter 3 specifically, which says that by which transgression, commonly called original sin, was the image of God utterly defaced in man. Now, he also goes on to say that Bollinger as well taught that the image of God was extinguished by the fall. But of course, I'm going to contend and suggest that Arakaki doesn't actually understand what the Reformed believe about the post-lapsarian image of God that remains in man. So, funny enough, he uses Augustine and Irenaeus sort of as contrasted readings of the fall, saying that, the Reformed understanding of the fall comes from Augustine's interpretation of the story, whereas the East aren't as limited. The East don't focus so much attention onto one guy, just onto Augustine, right? And he notes that for Augustine, Adam and Eve were mature adults, but that in contrast for Irenaeus, they were as infants or children who would grow into perfection. Now, what I think the irony of the contrast that he uses is that both Augustine and Irenaeus say that our image, likeness, and or nature was lost in and or through Adam and needs to be recovered or restored in Christ. Now, for one, Irenaeus, for example, in his Against Heresies, says that he, that is Christ, commenced afresh the long line of human beings and furnished us in a brief, comprehensive manner with salvation, so that what we had lost in Adam, namely to be according to the image and likeness of God, that we might recover in Christ Jesus. So, of course, Irenaeus, I think clearly here, teaches that yes, the image and likeness of God is lost in Adam and it is recovered in Christ. Now, Augustine here does not use the term image or likeness, but I think it's a similar idea where he talks about our nature being lost. So he says that our nature, which was lost through Adam, might through him, that is Christ, be recovered, who said that he was come to seek and save that which was lost, and whose coming the old fathers, likewise who loved God, believed. And now we can sort of get into what the Reformed actually believe about the extent to which the image of God remains in man after the fall. So Calvin, for example, he's usually the guy that most of the Orthodox are going to know. A lot of the Orthodox are not going to be familiar uh, either at all, or if they are, very little, with other people like Turretin or Petrus Van Maastricht or anyone like that. So first we'll start off with someone popular, right? So Calvin says that, wherefore, although we grant that the image of God was not utterly effaced and destroyed in him, that is in Adam, it was, however, so corrupted that anything which remains is fearful of deformity, and therefore our deliverance begins with that renovation which we obtain from Christ, who is therefore called the second, because he restores us to true and substantial integrity. Now, Turretin, when, prompts the question whether Adam, by his fall, lost the image of God, and he says that we affirm. But he qualifies it by saying that by the divine image, we do not understand generally whatever gifts upright man received from God, spoken of in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, or especially certain remains of it existing in the mind and heart of man after the fall, in which sense we understand Genesis 9:6 and James 3:9. Rather, we understand it strictly of the principal part of that image, which consisted of holiness and wisdom. In this sense, we treat of it in the present question. Petrus van Maastricht likewise says that the image of God, which we have spoken about, neither completely perished through sin nor completely survived from sin. Therefore, it remains in some measure. It remains, I say, to the extent that it consists, one, in the very nature of man, of the body and soul, two, in the natural faculties of the soul, the intellect and will, three, in certain gifts of the intellect and will, insofar as amongst the worst is still seen some use of reason, and also some propensity to good, even moral good. However, the image of God perished with respect to its most excellent parts, namely original righteousness, insofar as we are all born as children of wrath, dead in sins, uh, and immortality of every sort, of natural, spiritual, and eternal life, the perfection of dominion, and the happiness of paradise. So, of course, here we can see that the Reformed do not believe that the image of God is completely lost in every sense. They only believe that the image of God perished with respect to its most excellent parts, as Van Maastricht here says, right? We still, of course, we're still composed, of course, of body and soul. We still have our natural faculties of the intellect and will, things like that. And so that is not at all in contention. What is in contention is whether we still, what still remains is, the greater parts of the image of God, which are things like original righteousness and the immortality of the soul. So that is really the issue, not whether any remain of the image of God is still in us. Now, he goes on to make the following comment. One of the key aspects of the doctrine of total depravity is the belief that the fall deprived humanity of any capacity for free will, rendering them incapable of desiring to do good or to believe in God. Yet, a study of the early church shows a broad theological consensus existed that affirmed belief in free will. And then he refers to J.N.D. Kelly's early Christian doctrines, which I have, to prove that the second century apologists unanimously believed in human free will. Kelly says that the apologists, quote, are unanimous that man is endowed with free will, and that against the Stoic doctrine of fate, Justin develops the idea of human responsibility. And then Arakaki proceeds to cite Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Cyril of Jerusalem, Gregory of Nyssa, John of Damascus, and a 6th century desert father, St. John of the Latter. He quotes Irenaeus, who affirmed humanity's capacity for faith, and says that another witness to free will is Cyril of Jerusalem, who repeatedly affirmed human free will. He says that Gregory of Nyssa likewise taught it, and the John of Damascus taught how God made man a rational being endowed with free will. Sounds like the Westminster Confession. Concluding that therefore Calvin's belief in total depravity was based upon narrow theological perspective, right? Because of his almost exclusive reliance on Augustine. So of course the problem here is going to be that the way that it's presented, right, by Arakaki here and by the Orthodox a lot of the time is that the Reformed just deny free will simpliciter. No qualifications are made most of the time. And so, of course, that's not even the propositions here that are wrong. It's more so his assumptions because, yeah, of course, the fathers believed in free will, but so do we. No, of course, a lot of people understand that we say that, but even then, I don't think that they accurately understand what we mean by that. Now, when he quotes the fathers, one of the first fathers that he quotes is Justin Martyr, and I specifically wanted to note his quotation from Justin, because Justin says that for the coming into being first was not in our own power, and in order that we may follow those things which please him, choosing them by means of the rational faculties he has himself endowed us with, he both persuades us and leads us to faith. right? So for just the martyr, I actually just found this interesting in his first apology, because not only does God persuade us, but in some sense he also leads us to faith according to Justin, which does sound like he has some sort of understanding of the efficacy of grace that we're going to see later, of course, in Augustine, and especially dominant in the West and debates in the West. Now he concludes that when the Orthodox Church confronted Calvinism in the 1600s, it already had a rich theological legacy to draw upon. And then he quotes Decree 14 of Dositheus' Confession, which rejects the Calvinist belief in total depravity. He says that we believe, well, the confession says that we believe in falling by the transgression to have become comparable and like unto the beast, that is, to have been utterly undone and to have fallen from his perfection and impassibility, yet not to have lost the nature and power which he had received from the supremely good God. Now, Arcocky doubles down on his claims, on what I think are his mistakes, when he responds to a response of part one of his article, like I'm doing, which he calls In Defense of Plucking the Tulip, a response to Jacob Aitken. Now, Jacob Aitken, I'm not too familiar with him. I don't know if he still goes by, what is it, like, he called himself like the the Huguenot Covenanter or something to that effect. Not too familiar with him, but he did have a good article, which I'll probably link in the description. But he had a good response to Arakaki's Plucking Tulip. And when, of course, Arakaki responds to it, he says a few things that I think just really show his ignorance once again. So he says that Aiken refers to Muller on liberum arbitrium, or free choice. And in response, Arakaki says that I challenge him to provide an excerpt from an official action by a reformed body, past to present, that endorses Muller's position on liberum arbitrium. Now, the thing with this demand is that you could interpret it one of two ways, right? And I think that one is a more natural interpretation. Now, of course, you could interpret this as meaning that he demands that someone finds an excerpt from a reformed body where they endorse Muller's position in contrast to Helm's position, let's say. Because, of course, there's the whole debate between Muller and Helm over the appropriateness of using terms like compatibilism as descriptions of Reformed thought on freedom, right, in the Reformed scholastics. And of course, like the question over synchronic contingency and the concept of the simultaneity of potencies. But I doubt that this is what Arkaki has in mind. I think that he's just asking for a reformed body that endorses Muller's affirmation of liberum arbitrium and his position that the Reformed fully embrace it. And that we can definitely prove, right? Because one can find basic affirmations of free choice in many of the Reformed confessions. Now, he says that Jacob Aiken took issue with his understanding that the Scots Confession teaches that as a result of the fall, the divine image was eradicated from human nature. And then he proceeds to criticize Aiken's claim that by eradicated, the Reformed mean that the image of God was marred. Now, in sad criticism, Arakaki admits that Aiken's appeal to Hodge and to the Lutheran formula of concord do help Aiken's case, but he suggests that Aiken failed in his goal because he didn't, quote, cite from Reformed confessional documents. And of course, since he thinks that Aiken did a bad job by not citing Reformed confessional documents, I thought, why not cite the synopsis of a pure theology, right? Doesn't get much better than that. Now, in Disputation 17 on free choice, the synopsis of a pure theology, we read, then again, in man's corrupt state, wherein man is born only naturally and bound up by original sin, although he had not lost the intellect in his intelligence, nor the natural freedom of choice in his will, he retained his natural faculties, along with the physical substance of his soul, which formed the principle of his actions, and he retained the remote and passive ability to undertake the opposite. Nevertheless, he lost the righteousness and goodness in both his intellect and his will. Indeed, he took on the opposite, sinful inclination. So, of course, here you do have an affirmation that after the fall, man does retain his natural faculties, right? He does retain, as it says here, the remote and passive ability to undertake the opposite. So here we do have a reformed confessional body, you could say, that Arakaki demands. Now he notes that Aiken does appeal to Mahler to make his point, but very strangely, at least I found, Arakaki says that even though this might be the case, what is striking is Mr. Aiken's failure to quote from Calvin or the major Reformed confessions. Right, so he thinks that Aiken should stop quoting from Muller and that he should start quoting from Calvin and the Reformed Confessions. And he actually asks if, quote, Professor Muller speaks with authority for the Reformed tradition today. Now, of course, for many of us, that seems like a pretty simple answer, right? Because the answer unironically is yes. So hopefully he's become aware of that in the past decade. But now we can quote from the Reformed Confessions on free choice or free will per Arakaki's request. Now, of course, you have the classic Westminster Confession that God have endued the will of man with that natural liberty, that it is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to good or evil. You have the first Helvetic Confession that says, wherefore we indeed attribute to man free will, as we who experience knowing and wanting to do good and evil. You have the second Helvetic Confession that says, but in outward things no man denies that both the regenerate and unregenerate have their free will. For man has this constitution common with other creatures, to whom he is not inferior, to will some things and to know other things. You have Father Beza's confession of 1560, answering the question, what free will remains in man after sin? Nevertheless, we do not deny that men have sufficient light to leave them without excuse, and we spoil them not, nor deprive them of their natural faculties and powers, which we affirm not to have been taken away, not to have been taken completely away, but as corrupted as reason, judgment, will, and such others. And then you have the Bohemian Confession, Article 5 of free will. We confess that it has some degree of freedom to accomplish external civil order and justice which is subject to reason, so that in such works as reported, many may use his intellect, judgment, and will, and in all his undertaking may have no excuse before God, etc., etc. Now, Aiken rightly points out in his response to Arakaki's article, because Jacob Aiken then has another response to Arakaki's response to Aiken's initial response, where Aiken says that what Arakaki is not realizing is that the Reformed and the Romanist opponents were both operating off a loosely Thomist Aristotelian psychology. The will is the faculty of choosing, and it follows the intellect. The will, as such, does not choose the good unto salvation, because the intellect does not move towards the good unto salvation. Now, Arakaki says that Orthodoxy rejects the doctrine of irresistible grace because this doctrine assumes the absence of human free will, again, with this inaccurate notion, of course, like we've just seen. And he repeats his earlier claim about the fathers affirming free will, referring to the letter to Diognetus, which he says contains a clear affirmation of human free will and the rejection of salvation by compulsion, as he calls it. So very clearly, Arakaki understands quote-unquote irresistible grace or effectual calling, whatever one wishes to call it, as salvation by compulsion. The letter to Diognetus says, he sent him as to men, he sent him as a savior, he sent him in the seeking to persuade, not to compel us, for violence has no place in the character of God. Now, of course, we take no issue with this because we also reject the notion that men are compelled to God. Here you have Turretin saying that with respect to renovation, because the Holy Spirit renews the hearts within and works a true and sincere love in them, by which is a willing people, not by compulsion and by the spirit of bondage, but spontaneously and sweetly they are impelled by the spirit of adoption to duty. Now he goes on to assert that the underlying flaw of Reformed soteriology is the emphasis on God's sovereignty to the denial of love, and he goes on to make similar comments, really the same thing, on, and he suggests that the following question is important. How can a gift be free if there's no freedom of choice? Which, once again, I should note, is falsely assuming a Reformed denial of free choice simplicity. Now, just as it was shown previously with Bradshaw, with Dyer, with Urham, with Robinson, with Cobain, etc., Arkaki as well accuses the Reformed of quote-unquote implicit monothelitism, which is precisely why Reformed views on grace and free choice are allegedly incompatible with orthodoxy. He specifically says that the Calvinists' denial of human free will and their insistence on the dominance of the divine will over human will parallels the heresy of monothelitism. Now, he has additional related comments, but before, for anyone who isn't actually aware, now most people probably are, but for anyone who isn't aware, the thing that they're getting out with monothelitism that we'll see is that the Reformed have this understanding of monergism or monoenergism, and that the reason it parallels the ancient heresy of monothelitism is because in monothelitism, Christ only has one will, the divine will, right? And so they're trying to make a parallel where you have this heretical Christology that is the same really for the Reformed, but applied to a different area of theology, that being soteriology and or anthropology. I suppose it fits into both, right? Where they think that we're suggesting that in salvation, only one will is active. And that's going to be what we're going to contend against in a minute. Now, some additional related comments are where he says that according to the Reformed, especially Calvin, it seems, man becomes more an instrument of an omnipotent deity than a free agent cooperating with divine grace. Free will exists, but only for mundane matters, not in relation to spiritual matters. And then he errs again. He goes on and on. He says that the alternative approach to monergism is synergism, the belief that salvation is the result of human will cooperating working with divine grace. Thus, where orthodoxy's synergism allows for human free will or choice in salvation, Calvinism's monergism excludes it. Now, this is just wrong, right? And that's what we're going to analyze. He says that he wants to urge his Reformed friends to take seriously what he has to say about Reformed monergism and the heresy of monothelitism. But sadly, we cannot take it seriously because it is not a serious objection. And he notes that the Reformed tradition does affirm free will, but qualifies it to the extent that one wonders whether free will is essential to human existence. And then he claims that the Reformed position on free will is the following. Anyone can posit, but the points that I'm going to take issue with are point 2 and point 5. Now, here, of course, point 2 it is inaccurate because the Reformed do not deny free will simplicity, as I said, and the citations that it gives from the canons of Dort and from the Westminster Confession don't prove that. They don't suggest that. They only suggest that man has lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation. And then point 5 is inaccurate because the citation that he gives from the Westminster Confession simply says that it's only in the state of glory that the, quote, will of man is made perfectly and immutably free to good alone. The ability that man lost in the fall is present in the regenerate, right? So I don't really see why Arkaki thinks that like the will that we lost in the fall is only regained in the state of glory according to the Reformed. Arkaki says that the last statement, or at least what he interprets point 5 to mean, doesn't make any sense because it would mean the possibility of apostasy in the age to come. Now, of course, I'm not seeing the connection between this at all, so I'm not exactly sure how he got to this conclusion. But nonetheless, he's wrong in suggesting that according to the Reformed theological system, the only time humanity ever possessed the freedom with respect to the relationship with God was prior to the fall, but not after. Now here we can finally get into what the Reformed actually believe about quote-unquote monergism and synergism. Now, the tricky thing about this, and one of the reasons that I try to avoid the terms if I can, is that there are various definitions of the two terms. Monergism is inaccurately understood by the Orthodox, amongst others, oftentimes to mean that only one will, that is the divine will, is active in the entirety of the process of salvation, and that man's will is always passive. Now, according to monergism.com, not that it's an authority, but many of us use it. It has good resources sometimes. The concept is understood as the following. So monergism is a theological term in which the prefix mono means one and the suffix ergism or ergon means to work, or together they mean the work of one, or salvation is of the Lord alone, not a cooperation of man and God. Now, of course, this is simply like biblical language, right? Salvation is of the Lord. That's just what Scripture says. The thing is that with this in mind, it seems that sometimes people are sort of talking past each other, because for those who are more comfortable with using the term monergism as descriptors of themselves, they're usually what they're rejecting when they reject synergism is any sort of notion that man in some way works with God to bring about his salvation, or any form where you could say that God does 50% of the work and man does the other 50%, or even that God does 99% of the work and man does 1%. That is really what is being rejected, not any understanding of having an active will in the process of salvation. William Perkins, in his treatise Reformed Catholic, wherein he discusses where we agree with the Church of Rome, he talks about the points of agreement, but then he goes on to talk about the points of dissension, where we dissent from the papist. He says when he talks about free will, that the second kind of spiritual actions or things concern the kingdom of God is repentance, faith, the conversion of a sinner, new obedience, and such like, in which we likewise in part join with the Church of Rome and say that in the first conversion of a sinner, man's free will concurs with God's grace as a fellow or co-worker in some sort. For man's will is not passive in all and every respect. To this end, says Augustine, he which made you without you will not save you without you. Turretin, asking the question whether in the first moment of conversion man is merely passive, or whether his free will or whether his will cooperates in some measure with the grace of God. The former we affirm and deny, the latter against all synergists. Now, what does Turretin understand synergists to be? Turretin understands synergists to be people who say that in the first moment of conversion, man's will cooperates in some measure with the grace of God, and the man's will is active, also known as regeneration. And that is going to be the key point here, that for the Reformed Orthodox, the problem is not whether man's will is active in salvation, it's whether man's will is active in what we're going to call regeneration, or the first moment of conversion, things like that. Now he says the question does not concern the second stage of conversion, in which it is certain that man is not merely passive, but cooperates with God, or rather operates under him. Indeed, he actually believes and converts himself to God. While being acted upon, he acts, and being regenerated and moved by God, he moves himself to the exercise of the new life. Rather, the question concerns the first moment when he is converted and receives new life by regeneration. We contend that he is merely passive in this as a receiving subject and not as an acting principle. Abrakel talks about man's passivity in the moment of regeneration, and says that we are not speaking here of a man who already has been regenerated, but rather of an unregenerate man being regenerated. Such a person is passive rather than active. Gerhardus Voss, answering the question, is conversion exclusively a work of God, or is man also active in it? Answers by saying that in it, man is worked on by God's grace, such that he converts himself, that is, consciously turns from sin and turns to God. The subject that is active here is, however, the regenerated man, not the old natural man. Now, moving on to unconditional election, Arkaki refers us to Article 6 of the first set of doctrine and to Calvin himself as denying the basic understanding that, God elects upon the basis of his foreknowledge. So he foresees who would make a right use of their free will, and he therefore elects them. And he goes on to say that the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional election is at odds with the church fathers who taught that predestination is based upon God's foreknowledge. And then he quotes John of Damascus and Gregory of Palamas. Now, of course, Arkaki and the Eastern Orthodox clearly deny predestination ante previsa merita, and he describes unconditional election as Calvinistic, just like it's described at the Synod of Jerusalem, but he never mentions, at least in this article, he does in other articles mentions, like I said, the medieval scholastics, but he does not mention Augustine or the broader Augustinian tradition on predestination ante previsa merita in this article for some reason. He then refers to Article 3 of the Confession of Josephus, which condemns the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional election. Now, which says that God is the common Father of all, in no respecter of persons, and would have all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. But since he foreknew the one would make a right use of their free will and the other a wrong, he predestinated the one or condemned the other. So, yeah, this is very clearly an affirmation of the understanding that you're going to see in the Remonstrance, right, that the Arminians are going to have, that God elects upon the basis of his foreknowledge of what would happen, who would actually choose him via their own free will. And that's the reason that they're elect, because of something that he foresaw in them. So it's the standard Remonstrant understanding that the Eastern Orthodox take, interestingly enough. Moving on to limited atonement, he immediately goes off in a bad start in this section because he mistakenly describes the more particularist view of limited atonement as the belief that Christ only died for the elect, not for the whole world. Now, of course, the reason that this is very sloppy is because regardless of what someone thinks about the more particular understanding, because, of course, you can be reformed and hold to a hypothetical universalist view, but since we're talking about the more particularist view, even such advocates of that position would say that Christ died only for the elect, and they would still agree that the proposition Christ died for the world is true. Essentially, such advocates would never say that Christ did not die for the world. So Arkaki is already mistaken as soon as he starts in this section, and he quotes the 8th article of the second head of doctrine in the Canons of Dort, and I emphasize those only, as we'll see, because that's what he emphasized, and he believes that this sort of proves or really exemplifies the particularist understanding of limited atonement, where the synod says, it was the will of God that Christ, by the blood of the cross, whereby he confirmed the new covenant, should effectually redeem out of every people, tribe, nation, and language all those and those only who were from eternity chosen to salvation and given to him by God the Father, that he should confer upon them faith, which, together with all the other saving gifts of the Holy Spirit, he purchased for them by his death. Now, of course, I can see sort of why he misunderstands the position, because this can be interpreted in an orthodox way from hypothetical universalists, right? Because the problem here is going to be that both hypothetical universalists and even those who take a more particularist view are going to say that they affirm the Lombardian formula to an extent, right? Christ died sufficiently for all, but effectually only for the elect. And here, all that the Synod is affirming is the latter part of that formula, that he died effectually for the elect, which does not exclude any sense wherein he could die sufficiently for the non-elect, right? So, and if you actually read the second head of doctrine, there is nothing there that actually can demonstrate that the hypothetical universalist's position is excluded, right? It's specifically worded in such a way, as I think Michael Lynch rightly notes, to accommodate to the hypothetical universalists. so that the English delegates at Dort are not excluded as being able to sign to what is written. They could fully agree with everything that is said in the second head of doctrine because none of it actually condemns their view. So, therefore, Arkaki is wrong in suggesting that the canons of Dort is explicit in its affirmation of limited atonement, quote unquote, in light of his definition, which does exclude hypothetical universalism. But he is right about the fact that there is debate over Calvin's position on the matter. He refers to John 3:16, 1 Timothy 2, 3-6, 1 John 2:2 as examples of the alleged number of biblical passages that can be used to refute the doctrine of limited atonement. Now, interestingly enough, regarding 1 John 2:2, Calvin interprets it to mean the following. He says, here a question may be raised. How have the sins of the whole world been expiated? I pass by the dotages of the fanatics, who under this pretense extend salvation to all the reprobate, and therefore to Satan himself. Such a monstrous thing deserves no refutation. They who seek to avoid this absurdity have said that Christ suffered sufficiently for the whole world, but efficiently only for the elect. This solution has commonly prevailed in the schools. Though then I allow that what has been said is true, yet I deny that it is suitable to this passage. For the design of John was no other than to make this benefit common to the whole church. So here we clearly see that in Calvin's mind, interpreting 1 John 2:2, he notes the existence of the Lombardian formula, it seems, I think very clearly, and interesting for a contribution to discussions over his view, he does say that he allows the distinction. He simply denies that this is St. John's intent here, at least. That all that John is saying here is that this benefit is common to the whole church, sort of parallels Augustine's interpretation of, say, 1 Timothy 2:4, where you could have someone who believes that Christ's satisfaction does extend to the non-elect, while at the same time interpreting the texts that are often brought up in these discussions in a different way, such as Augustine, and then possibly as Calvin, if he does have a universal satisfaction view. And Arkaki says that in the Institutes, Calvin only cites 1 John 2:2 3 times, and that Calvin never explains the latter part of the verse. But of course, and that's true from what I've seen, but of course he has a commentary on it, so he should have checked that out. But I only found 2 references in the Institutes. The third reference that Arkaki gives only mentions 1 John 2:1, right? That, if we sin, we have an advocate with the Father. And he talks about that, but not 1 John 2:2. And then Arkaki goes on to say that the real challenge for those who appeal to the above passages lies in the semantic tactics, he calls them, used by Calvinists, in which they argue that all in the world are not to be taken literally, but as referring to only those predestined for salvation. And then his footnote reads, medieval Catholic theologians who sought to defend double predestination in the face of 1 Timothy 2:4 would employ a more philosophical line of defense, that they drew upon the distinction between God's antecedent will and his ordinate will, which I think sounds like Aquinas' distinction between antecedent will and consequent will that he draws from John of Damascus. I'm not exactly sure if they're the same. I've never heard of ordinate will, but it seems to me that that is what he's referring to. But of course, it's simply absurd to suggest that the medieval Catholics used a philosophical line of defense for their understanding of reprobation and God's will, whereas the Reformed didn't. And that's why I do plan on doing a future video on distinctions that were made concerning God's will according to the Reformed Orthodox. Now, Arkaki notes that some of the Reformed, for example, Ursinus and Beza, understand the terms all in the world to refer to the elect in those passages that Arkaki has used, in his words, to refute the doctrine of limited atonement. And then he cites Roger Wilson on the subject, which anyone can read here, but all I'll read is that Wilson says it is not always easy to determine with assurance what is the frame of reference in view, right? So talking about how really terms are going to depend upon their context, which seems fairly standard for anyone to admit. Not entirely sure why Arkaki has a problem with that, because he goes on to say that this fact does impart a certain imperviousness to Reformed theology. And of course, as always, he has to use it to take a shot at sola scriptura, that, oh, context determines what words mean, so sola scriptura is not really practical. And then he says that historical theology can help us assess the compelling truth claims, to which I actually agree with, at least to an extent, maybe not to the extent that he does, but I can say something similar. And then he says that historical theology shows there existed a widespread belief among the church fathers in God's universal love for humanity, which is also a different subject that we should get into at some point. Now, Arkaki is partly right, but partly wrong in what he says about the distinctive of Calvin on perseverance, because he tells his readers that Calvin's position was that the elect cannot fall from salvation even after their conversion. They will inevitably be saved. Now, of course, this is true, but I think that the thing that's accurate about Calvin's distinctive and what really differentiates the Reformed from Augustine himself in perseverance is that, of course, Calvin and the Reformed were going to say that only the elect can be justified, in a state of grace. Only the elect go through that process of salvation. Whereas for Augustine, of course, the non-elect can be justified. They can be in a state of justification, temporarily saved, but only the elect are given the gift of perseverance. So my only issue with Arakaki's understanding of the distinctiveness of the Reformed on perseverance is that the latter part of what he says is applicable to Augustine and to any, I'm pretty sure, all Roman Catholics as well. That's only the elect are given the gift of perseverance. Or as Arakaki puts it, that the elect, even after their conversion, they will inevitably be saved, right? Because Augustine would say that, but of course, like the Roman Catholics, they're going to agree with that, but they're not going to agree with the concept that the elect cannot fall from salvation, that they can't fall into mortal sin, and thereby don't have to go to confession. So it's partly true, partly sloppy, I would say. And then he gives the following inaccurate analysis once again, where he says that in contrast to Calvinism, the Orthodox understanding of the perseverance of the saints is based upon synergy, or cooperation with God's grace and deification, are becoming partakers in the divine nature. The Confession of Josephus affirms the synergistic approach to salvation in contrast to the monergistic approach found in the Reformed confessions. So the same idea of synergy that we briefly touched on. And of course, here you can pause it if you want, but essentially just saying that we do cooperate with God's grace, and that this grace cooperates with us and enables us, etc., etc. And lastly, we'll end with the third and fourth head of doctrine, Article 12, at the Synod of Dort, which, as we saw earlier, just like Gerhardus Voss, just like O'Brockwell and Turretin and Perkins, at the Synod of Dort, we are told that whereupon the will thus renewed is not only actuated and influenced by God, but in consequence of this influence becomes itself active. Wherefore also man himself is rightly said to believe and repent by virtue of that grace received. So that is the big thing to remember, that in consequence of God's influence, the will does become active. We do not deny that the will is active in salvation. We simply deny, when we are talking about monergism, so to speak, that the will is active in bringing about its regeneration, right? In that initial conversion, that somehow man's will could bring it about, cooperating with God's grace, or even that man's will could reject it, simply because we believe that man's will is passive in such a process. But of course, when it comes to the entirety of the process of salvation, we do believe that God enables us, that our will is active, and that we do, in some sense, cooperate with God's grace as fellow co-workers, in the sense that William Perkins expounded on it. So those are really the main ideas. Not too many concluding remarks. Simply, the goal really is just to further serious conversations with other groups, because the Orientals do this, the Eastern Orthodox do this. They make the same mistakes. They see it from the guys that they like. I referenced Bradshaw, I referenced Dyer, Robinson, Cobain. They like these guys, and so if you see it from these guys, you're going to see it sort of trickle down into the fans, right? So that's not what we want to see. We want people to understand each other, and hopefully this can help others with that. So other than that, that's pretty much the end of this discussion. It's not too comprehensive, but I think it's just the right amount. And that's about it. We'll see what we discuss next time.